The last time I saw Daniel Whitfield, he was standing in the doorway of our apartment with a suitcase in his hand, telling me he couldn't build a future with someone who had nothing left to offer him. 5 years later, he was sitting across from me in a glass conference room on the 32nd floor of my own company, sliding a business proposal across the table, asking me to save the very future he once said I was too broken to be part of. He didn't recognize me. Not the color of my eyes. Not the sound of my voice. Not the woman he'd once promised forever to. He just saw a name on a folder, Adler Consulting Group, and a CEO he needed something from. He had no idea that the woman holding his company's survival in her hands was the same woman he'd walked out on when she had absolutely nothing. I want to tell you how that happened. Not the version where I magically became rich overnight, because that isn't what happened. I want to tell you the real version, the version with the fear, the failure, the humiliation, and the slow, stubborn climb back to myself. My name is Claire Adler, and this is my story. 3 years before that suitcase moment, I was 26 years old, and I thought I had my whole life figured out. I was working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising firm in Columbus, Ohio, but my real dream lived in the notebook I kept in my bag. A business plan for a boutique branding agency that would help small companies tell their stories the way big corporations could afford to. I'd sketched out logos on napkins. I'd built spreadsheets late at night while Daniel slept beside me, the blue light of my laptop the only thing awake in the room. Daniel and I had been together for 4 years by then. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, and within 6 months we were talking about the kind of future people build slowly, brick by brick, a house with a porch, maybe a dog, maybe kids somewhere down the road. He worked in finance, sharp and ambitious, the kind of man who color-coded his calendar and believed hard work always got rewarded eventually. I loved that about him, at first. I loved how certain he was about everything, because I wasn't always certain about myself. "You're going to build something incredible," he told me once, lying on the floor of our first apartment surrounded by moving boxes. "I mean it, Claire. When you get that agency off the ground, I'll be your first client." I believed him. I believed all of it, the porch, the dog, the promise. At the time, I didn't know that promises like that only mean something when a person is comfortable. I would learn that the hard way. For 2 years, I saved every spare dollar I could. I took on freelance design projects at night. I turned down vacations, new clothes, nice dinners, anything that wasn't essential, because I was building toward something. When I finally had enough saved to leave my job and launch Adler Creative full-time, Daniel seemed proud of me. He helped me pick out office furniture from a secondhand store. He told his coworkers about his girlfriend, the entrepreneur, like it was something to brag about. For the first 8 months, it worked. I picked up 3 small clients, a bakery, a landscaping company, and a local nonprofit. It wasn't much money, but it was mine, and it was growing. Then everything collapsed at once. My biggest client, a regional furniture chain that made up almost half my monthly income, filed for bankruptcy without warning. The invoice they owed me, nearly $11,000 for a full rebrand I'd already delivered, evaporated into a bankruptcy filing I had no power to fight. Around the same time, my landlord raised my studio's rent by 40%, and a laptop that ran my entire design workflow died 2 weeks after any warranty had expired. I remember sitting on the floor of my studio that night, surrounded by invoices I couldn't collect on, doing math that refused to work no matter how many times I ran it. I didn't tell Daniel everything at first. I told myself I could fix it before it became his problem too. That was my first mistake. Not the business failing. Businesses fail all the time, and I know now that's not a personal defect. My first mistake was believing that hiding my struggle would protect our relationship, when really, it just gave him more time to quietly decide I wasn't worth the risk. At first, when I finally told Daniel how bad things had gotten, he said all the right things. "We'll figure it out together," he said, squeezing my hand across the kitchen table. That's what couples do. For a few weeks, I believed him. But slowly, something in him started to shift. It began with small comments. He'd mention, almost casually, how a coworker's wife had just gotten promoted to VP. He'd sigh a little too heavily when I told him I couldn't split the rent that month. He started spending more evenings, working late, and when he came home, there was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. One night, I asked him to help me brainstorm how to recover the client relationships I'd lost. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something between pity and irritation. "Claire, maybe it's time to admit this isn't working," he said. "Maybe you should just get a stable job again. This whole business thing was always a risk." "It's not always going to be like this," I told him. "This is a setback, not the end." "How do you know that?" he asked. "How do you know it's not just who you are now? Someone who's always one bad month away from falling apart." I didn't have an answer for that. Not because he was right, but because I was too exhausted, too scared, and too in love with him to fight back the way I should have. I didn't realize it then, but that conversation would replay in my head for years. 3 weeks later, I lost the studio lease entirely. I moved my equipment into our apartment's spare bedroom, which used to be Daniel's home office. He didn't say much about it at the time, but I noticed he started closing that door whenever friends came over, like he was embarrassed by what was behind it. I started applying for part-time jobs to cover our bills while I tried to rebuild my client list on the side. I took a position folding clothes at a retail store on weekends, something I never imagined myself doing after 4 years of college and 2 years of running my own business. Daniel never said it outright, but I could feel the shift in how he looked at me. I had gone, in his eyes, from someone building an empire to someone barely keeping her head above water. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being the woman he was proud to introduce to his coworkers and started being a problem he didn't know how to solve. The breakup didn't happen all at once. It happened over one specific Tuesday night in October, the kind of ordinary evening that becomes permanently unordinary the second it's over. I had just gotten off a 9-hour retail shift, my feet aching, my hands smelling like cardboard and folded denim. I came home hoping for something simple, a hug, a meal, 5 minutes where I didn't have to think about money. Instead, I found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop closed and 2 suitcases already packed by the door. "What is this?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "I got the promotion," he said. "The one in Chicago. I'm taking it." For a moment, hope flickered in me, stupid, desperate hope. "That's amazing, Daniel. When do we leave?" He looked at me, and something in his face made my stomach drop before he even said the words. "I'm going alone, Claire." The kitchen went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. "I can't keep doing this," he continued, not quite meeting my eyes. "I can't build a life with someone who has nothing right now. I need stability. I need someone who isn't drowning every single month. I'm sorry, but I have to think about my future." "I am your future," I said, my voice breaking in a way I hated. "This is temporary, Daniel. This is a setback. I'm going to rebuild this." "Maybe," he said. "But I can't wait around to find out if you will." He said one more thing before he picked up his suitcases, something that would sit in my chest for the next 5 years like a stone I couldn't dissolve. "I fell in love with who you were becoming, Claire. Not who you are now." Then he was gone. The door closed. The apartment felt enormous and silent in a way it never had before, even though nothing in the room had physically changed. I didn't cry that night. I think I was too stunned to cry. I just sat on the kitchen floor for a long time, staring at the space where his suitcases used to sit by the door, trying to understand how 4 years of promises could disappear in the time it took to say a few sentences. At the time, I thought that was the worst night of my life. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of the hardest year of my life, but it was also, though I couldn't see it yet, the beginning of everything I would eventually become. The months after Daniel left were the loneliest of my life. I lost the apartment 2 months later because I couldn't cover the rent alone. I moved into a small room in my cousin Megan's house in Dayton, sleeping on a twin mattress surrounded by boxes I never fully unpacked because unpacking them felt like admitting this was my life now. I kept working retail. I kept trying to find design clients on the side, but every rejection felt personal in a way it hadn't before. I remember pitching a rebrand to a local coffee shop owner who looked at my portfolio, looked at me, and said, "No offense, but you seem like you're going through something. I need someone reliable." I wanted to scream that I was reliable, that the $11,000 I'd lost to a bankrupt client wasn't a character flaw, that heartbreak wasn't a professional disqualifier. Instead, I just said, "I understand," and drove home in silence. There was a night, about 5 months after the breakup, when I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot because I couldn't afford everything on my list, and I had to put items back one by one while the cashier waited. I remember sitting there afterward, gripping the steering wheel, wondering if Daniel had been right about me. Maybe I really was someone who fell apart the moment things got hard. Maybe I wasn't built for the life I wanted. I called my mother that night, something I rarely did when I was struggling, because I hated admitting weakness to anyone, even her. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," she told me. "You just have to take the next right step. Just the next one." It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the fear or the shame. But something about just the next step gave me enough air to breathe. The next right step, for me, turned out to be a woman named Renata Cole. Renata was a former creative director who now ran a small digital consultancy out of a shared workspace in downtown Columbus. I met her at a free networking event I almost didn't attend, mostly because I couldn't afford the suggested donation of $10 and had to ask if I could skip it. She wasn't impressed by my portfolio at first. She told me flatly that half my case studies looked generic and that my pricing structure made no sense. But she was impressed by something else. "You kept working after you lost that furniture client," she said, flipping through my laptop. "Most people would have quit. You didn't." "I didn't have a choice," I said. "Everyone has a choice," she said. "You chose to keep showing up. That's rarer than talent." She didn't offer me a job. She didn't offer me money. What she offered me was harder and more valuable, a chance to work for her, unpaid, for 8 weeks, shadowing her client strategy sessions in exchange for mentorship. It meant working 2 more jobs on top of retail. It meant sleeping 4 hours a night for 2 months. It meant showing up to strategy meetings exhausted, taking notes with a hand that sometimes shook from too much coffee and not enough food. But it also meant learning things I'd never learned in any marketing job: how to talk to CEOs, how to price my worth instead of my fear, how to build a brand strategy around a company's actual data instead of guesswork. I made mistakes constantly. I once presented an entire campaign concept to one of Renata's clients before realizing I'd misread their target demographic completely. I sat through the humiliation of watching the client's face fall as I backpedaled through my own presentation. Renata didn't rescue me in that meeting. She let me sit in the discomfort, and afterward, she simply said, "Now you know what happens when you don't triple-check your data. You won't make that mistake again." She was right. I never did. After 8 weeks, Renata didn't hire me outright, but she referred me to 3 small businesses that needed rebranding work. It wasn't a windfall. It was maybe $4,000 total, spread across 3 months of work. But it was mine, earned with my own hands, and it was the first real proof I had that Daniel's words weren't a prophecy. I wasn't rebuilding to prove him wrong. I want to be honest about that, because for a while, spite was a powerful motivator. Imagining his face if he ever saw me successful kept me working on nights I wanted to give up. But somewhere in that first year, the spite quietly transformed into something steadier. I simply wanted to build something because it was mine, because I was capable, because I refused to let one collapse define the rest of my life. What I discovered next changed everything. One of Renata's referral clients, a small logistics startup called Harrow Freight, asked me to help them completely reposition their brand before a major funding round. It was the biggest project I'd ever taken on, 6 figures in company valuation, resting partly on how well I could tell their story to investors. I said yes before I fully believed I could do it. I spent 3 weeks living on almost no sleep, building not just a visual identity, but an entire narrative strategy: who they were, why they mattered, what problem they solved that competitors didn't. When they presented to investors using the materials I built, they secured funding. Their CEO called me 2 days later, practically shouting with excitement. "You didn't just make us look good," he said. "You made us make sense." Investors said our story was the clearest they'd heard all quarter. That project didn't just pay well. It became my proof of concept. Harrow Freight referred me to 2 other startups. Those startups referred me to more. Within 18 months, I wasn't just doing freelance design work anymore. I was running a small consulting operation with 2 contractors helping me manage the workload. I want to be honest, it wasn't a straight line upward. I lost a major client in my second year because I underestimated how long a project would take and blew through the deadline, damaging my reputation with an entire industry circle for months. I had to have uncomfortable conversations, rebuild trust, and eat the cost of mistakes I made while learning how to run a real company instead of a side hustle. But slowly, project by project, failure by failure, Adler Creative became Adler Consulting Group. By year 3, I had a small office. By year 4, I had 11 employees and a reputation in the Midwest business community as the person you called when your company's story wasn't landing with investors or customers. By year 5, Adler Consulting Group had grown into something I could have never imagined sitting on that kitchen floor the night Daniel left. We had expanded into brand strategy, market positioning, and crisis communications for mid-sized companies across 3 states. We weren't a massive corporation, but in our specific niche, we were exactly the kind of firm that larger, struggling companies quietly sought out when they needed to save themselves. I hadn't thought about Daniel in months at that point. I want to be honest about that too. This isn't a story where I spent 5 years plotting revenge. I had simply built a life so full that there wasn't much room left for him in it. Until his name showed up on a proposal request form. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember that detail specifically, because Tuesdays had carried a strange weight for me ever since the night he left, when my head of business development, Priya, dropped a folder on my desk. "Big opportunity," she said. Mid-size finance firm out of Chicago, struggling with investor confidence after some bad press. They need a full narrative overhaul before their next funding round, or they might not survive the next 2 quarters. Contract could be worth $500,000 if it goes well. I opened the folder and saw the company name first, Whitfield Sterling Capital. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was probably a coincidence. Whitfield wasn't an unusual name. Then I saw the name of the executive requesting the meeting. Daniel R. Whitfield, managing partner. I sat very still for a long moment. Priya, sensing something in my silence, asked if everything was okay. "I'm fine," I said, and I meant it, though my hands weren't entirely steady when I closed the folder. I could have declined the meeting. Part of me considered it, not out of fear, but out of a genuine question I asked myself honestly. Did I actually want to sit across from him again? Was there anything left in me that needed closure, or had I already found it on my own, in the 5 years I'd spent becoming someone he never got to see? I decided to take the meeting for a simple reason, because turning it down would have meant making a business decision based on him, and I refused to let him take up that much space in my life ever again. If I was going to face him, it would be on my terms, in my building, across my table. I didn't tell Priya about our history. I didn't tell anyone. I simply said, "Schedule it for Thursday." He walked into our 32nd floor conference room wearing a suit that looked more expensive than the ones I remembered, but with dark circles under his eyes that no amount of tailoring could hide. For one full second, our eyes met, and there was nothing in his expression except the polite, slightly nervous look of a man meeting a CEO he needed something from. He didn't recognize me. 5 years had changed me, not just my appearance, though I'd cut my hair short and traded thrift store blazers for tailored suits, but something deeper in how I carried myself. I no longer walked into rooms hoping to be seen as enough. I walked in already certain of it. "Miss Adler," he said, extending his hand. "Daniel Whitfield. Thank you for making time for us. I know your firm's calendar is full these days." "Mr. Whitfield," I said, shaking his hand, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Please sit down." For the first 20 minutes, the meeting proceeded exactly like any other business meeting. He walked me through Whitfield's Sterling Capital's situation, a merger that had gone poorly, an investor relations crisis after a public statement had been misread by the press, declining confidence heading into their next funding round. His voice had the same confident cadence I remembered, but underneath it, I could hear something new: fear. "We need someone who can rebuild our narrative fast," he said. "Someone investors will trust immediately. Your firm came highly recommended. People say you don't just make companies look good, you make their story make sense again." I almost smiled at that. It was nearly the exact phrase the Harrow Freight CEO had used 5 years earlier, the moment that had first proven to me I had something real to offer the world. "Tell me what happened," I said. "All of it. I can't help you if I only get the version that makes you look good." He hesitated, and for a moment, something flickered across his face, a vulnerability I hadn't seen since the early years of our relationship, before he learned to armor himself with certainty. He told me about the merger falling apart, about a partner who'd made a reckless statement to a reporter, about board members quietly questioning his leadership. "If we don't fix this in the next 90 days, he admitted, we could lose our biggest investors. Everything I've built could collapse." I studied him for a long moment. There was something almost unbearably ironic in that sentence. Everything I've built could collapse, spoken by the man who had once told me that a collapse like that made someone unworthy of love. "I understand collapse," I said quietly. "Better than you might think." He looked at me curiously, but didn't press. "Not yet." The moment came on his second visit, a week later, when we sat in my office reviewing draft messaging for his investors. I'd pulled up an old case study to illustrate a point: the Harrow Freight rebrand, the project that had built my entire company. As I clicked to the section showing before and after materials, an old photo from that pitch day appeared on the screen behind me, one where I stood in front of a projector, laughing at something the CEO had said. Daniel's eyes moved to the screen, then back to me, then back to the screen again. I watched something shift behind his eyes, recognition assembling itself piece by piece, the way you might recognize an old song halfway through the second verse. "Claire," he said, his voice suddenly unsteady in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Claire Adler." "Your Adler Consulting Group," I said calmly. "Yes, it's me, Daniel." He sat back in his chair like something physical had struck him. For a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. I watched shock move across his face, followed by something that looked almost like disbelief, followed by an emotion I recognized immediately because I'd felt some version of it myself once: shame. "I had no idea," he finally said. "I swear to you, I had no idea this was your company. When Priya set up the meeting, I didn't even think." "Why would you?" I said. "The last time you saw me, I couldn't afford my own studio rent. You told me I had nothing." He flinched at that, visibly, like the words had physical weight. "Claire, You don't have to explain anything right now," I said, keeping my voice steady, professional. "We have a contract to discuss. Whether you and I want to have a personal conversation is a separate matter, and it can wait until after this meeting, if you want to have it at all." I want you to understand something about that moment. I wasn't performing coldness to hurt him. I genuinely felt calm. 5 years earlier, this moment would have destroyed me. The shock of seeing him, the vindication of watching his face crumble. But sitting there, I realized something had already happened inside me long before that meeting. I had already stopped needing anything from him. Not an apology. Not recognition. Not revenge. I had already won. long before he ever walked back into my life. We finished the contract negotiation professionally over the following 2 weeks. My team built Whitfield Sterling Capital a new investor narrative, one built around transparency instead of spin. I insisted on that, because I'd learned the hard way that stories built on hiding weaknesses always collapse eventually. The strategy worked. Within 6 weeks, investor confidence stabilized, and Daniel's board backed off their threats to remove him. But there was a twist neither of us saw coming until the final week of the contract. While researching Whitfield Sterling's investor history for our narrative work, my research director, Marcus, flagged something unusual: a small investment fund listed among Whitfield Sterling's early-stage backers years earlier. One that had quietly pulled funding from several small businesses right around the time my own business had collapsed. It took some digging, but eventually we traced it back. The fund that had abruptly pulled financing from the furniture chain that went bankrupt owing me $11,000. The collapse that had started my entire downward spiral 5 years earlier had been managed, in part, by a senior partner at the firm Daniel worked for at the time. Daniel hadn't caused my collapse. I want to be clear about that, because I don't believe in twisting facts to make a story more satisfying than the truth allows. He wasn't secretly responsible for my business failing. But when I mentioned the connection to him, almost in passing, expecting no reaction at all, his face went pale. "I remember that fund," he said slowly. "I remember when they pulled back from smaller accounts. I was junior then. I didn't understand the scope of who it affected. I never imagined it touched you. It wasn't a dramatic villain reveal. It was something quieter and, in some ways, sadder. The realization that the collapse that ended my relationship, that sent me spiraling into a year of poverty and humiliation, had partly originated from the same industry. The same financial ecosystem that Daniel had built his entire career inside of. He hadn't caused it directly, but he had, in some distant way, been standing on the same ground that pulled the floor out from under me. "I left you because I thought you'd failed to build something sustainable," he said quietly. "I never once considered that some of what happened to you might not have been your fault at all." "It wouldn't have mattered," I said. "Even if none of it was my fault, you still left because you were scared of struggling beside me." That part was always true, regardless of what caused the collapse. He didn't argue with that. I think, for the first time since he'd walked back into my life, he understood that the truest failure hadn't been the money. It had been what he chose to do when things got hard. On our last meeting before the contract officially closed, Daniel asked if we could talk, not about business, but about us. We sat in my office after everyone else had left for the evening, the city lights of Chicago's satellite skyline glowing faintly through the window, the same kind of city lights that used to represent, to both of us, the future we thought we were building together. "I think about that night constantly," he said. "The things I said to you. I told myself for years that I was being practical, realistic, that I was protecting my future. But watching you build all of this," he gestured vaguely at the office, at the framed magazine feature on my wall, at the entire life surrounding us, "I think I was just scared, Claire. I was 27 and scared of struggling, and it was easier to leave than to fight for something difficult." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I wasn't excusing him, but I understood him. Fear makes people do things that feel rational in the moment and monstrous in hindsight. "Is there any chance," he said carefully, "that we could?" "No," I said, gently but firmly, before he could finish the sentence. "Daniel, I'm not angry anymore. I don't carry what happened between us as a wound I need you to heal. But the version of me who needed you to come back and prove I was worth staying for, she doesn't exist anymore. I built a life that doesn't have room for that kind of waiting." "I understand," he said quietly. "I don't say that to hurt you," I continued. "I say it because it's the truest thing I know. You didn't just leave a relationship 5 years ago. You left a woman who was drowning and needed someone to reach for her. I reached for myself instead, over and over, for 5 years, until I stopped drowning. That version of strength, I built that alone. I'm not interested in retroactively sharing credit for it. He nodded slowly, and something in his posture settled, like a man finally accepting a verdict he'd known was coming. For what it's worth, he said, standing to leave, you were always capable of this. I just wasn't patient enough or brave enough to wait and see it happen beside you. I know, I said. That's the part I've made peace with. It was never really about whether I was enough. It was about whether you were ready to stay through the parts that weren't easy. You weren't. And that's okay. I am. I still think about that kitchen floor sometimes, the night I sat there in the silence after he left, convinced that his words were some kind of verdict on who I was. I know now that they weren't a verdict. They were simply the limits of what he was willing to endure for someone he loved. That's not a reflection of my worth. It never was. The version of me who rebuilt Adler Consulting Group from a spare bedroom in my cousin's house didn't do it to prove Daniel wrong, even though for a while, spite was fuel I didn't apologize for using. I did it because somewhere along the way, in the exhausted nights and the humiliating rejections and the small, hard-won victories, I discovered I was capable of things I never would have found out about myself if my life had stayed comfortable. Being abandoned when I had nothing didn't break me, even though it felt, at the time, like the ending of everything. It turned out to be the beginning of the only person I ever really needed to become, not for him, not for anyone watching, but for myself. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from my story, it's this. The moment someone tells you that you have nothing left to offer is not the truth about who you are. It's simply the truth about who they were willing to stay for. Let that be their limitation, not your definition. I didn't need Daniel to come back and recognize what I'd built in order for it to be real. It was already real, brick by brick, failure by failure, long before he ever walked back into my life. And the woman sitting across from him in that conference room wasn't trying to make him regret leaving. She simply no longer needed him to know who she'd become. That was the whole victory right there.